Well, you all can judge for yourself about how much I know about the 14th Amendment. I'm sure some of you think what I don't know about the 14th Amendment. This is a little awkward because when I was preparing these comments, I was looking at a different I was thinking about a different aspect of Michael's paper. So I hope you all will bear with me about that. For me, one of the most important aspects of his paper is that he, I think, quite properly characterizes the 14th Amendment as a change in the structure of federalism. As much, that is, the standard account of it is it's this new grant of rights. But it was understood in 1866 primarily, and if you look at the cases after 1866, primarily in terms of a change in federalism. That is, that most states already recognized those rights, but that now that the federal government will have the authority to enforce those rights when it didn't have the authority to enforce those rights before. That is, it took rights that were already generally accepted and made them into federal rights. Now that has implications for a wide variety of different kinds of constitutional theory. For example, it suggests that this whole business of talking about the counter-majoritarian difficulty was a dead end from the beginning and was wrongly and was just a wrong direction. But that's not part of the Originalist Conference. What I want to do just very briefly is talk about the dilemma that the Section 5 authority creates for originalists, depending on what variety of originalists that you are, given this idea of the 14th Amendment as a change in federalism. The dilemma is as follows, that unlike Michael, and I think you should probably read my other book as well. Everybody should read all of my books. But I do not believe that the text itself was a group of open-ended concepts. Indeed, if one looks at the history of the drafting of the text, there is a tremendous effort on the part of particularly conservative Republicans to make it non-open-ended. That is, the biggest change from the original, one of the biggest change from the original Bingham draft to the final draft was the change from equal protection, the rights of life, liberty, and property, to equal protection of the laws. And that was in response to complaints that equal protection of the rights of giving Congress the power to enforce equal protection of the rights of life, liberty, and property gave Congress the rights to enforce everything, whereas the concept of equal protection of the laws, even though it might look open-ended to some people who, misguided people, was a pretty well-established concept, like privileges or immunities, and like due process, that was perhaps unclear at the margins, but was not viewed as open-ended. So then those are two quite different things, right? So that if one is just looking at judicial enforcement, then all the judicial enforcement doctrine is wrong for reasons quite different from those that Mike pointed out. So so now you say, okay, I'm an originalist, I have to give a narrow vision of equal protection, due process, and privileges or immunities. Not necessarily with respect to the power of Congress. Now, depending on what variety of originalists you are, and I don't want, this is like, for non-originalists, it's like Jews watching Episcopalians and Methodists talk about the difference in doctrine, right? So I'm not going to talk about that very much, or at all. But when I can talk about anything, but the Section 5 authority was granted against the background of cases like McCulloch, which gave a very broad interpretation to congressional power to enforce congressional power to adopt any number of measures based upon Section 1. So here's the dilemma for originalists, and I simply will leave it as a dilemma, and as I say, it depends on what variety of originalist you are. On one hand, we have a 14th Amendment that is primarily a change in the structure of American federalism. Parentheses, look not only at the debates, but also at cases like Slaughterhouse, Straughter versus West Virginia, the civil rights cases. All of those cases are primarily concerned with constraining the 14th Amendment because of its impact on American federalism. So, and it's deliberately drafted to be only a narrow change, a relatively narrow change in the difference of the powers of Congress and the states. But on the other hand, you have this Section 5 authority, which is adopted in 1868 against the background of the pre-established precedents of McCulloch versus Maryland et al., which says that congressional authority is to be construed broadly and not to be constrained within the sort of narrow definitions of the text itself. So the question is, and I will simply leave it as a question, what's an originalist to do? Are you supposed to go with what people were talking about in terms of how they were deliberately structuring the language to limit the change in federalism, or in terms of the established precedent about how we interpret congressional powers generally, which gave us background principles that everyone had to know about at the time that the 14th Amendment was drafted? And I'll simply leave that as a question. I could give my answer, but it would take more time than this conference has. So thank you very much.